Some stories are loud, they demand attention, they shake the world, and they refuse to be ignored. But most stories, the ones that stay with us, they whisper, they linger in the quiet places, they hide in the corners of the memory. They wait in the dark until someone is willing to sit still long enough to hear them. That's what we do here. We slow down, we pour a cup of something strong, and we step into the shadows. Not to be afraid of them, but to understand what they're trying to tell us. Whether it's mystery from the past, a tragedy from our own backyard, or a story that never made the headlines. This is where we bring it to the table. This is where we talk about the things most people avoid. This is where the quiet becomes loud enough to matter. Welcome to Graveyard Coffee Talk, filmed right here in my cemetery office. I'm Chris. Grab your drink, settle in, and let's dive into the strange, the curious, and the dark, where the coffee is strong and the stories are restless. Some stories don't sit right, not because of ghosts or legends, but because of silence, because of the things that don't add up, because of the questions that never get answered. Tonight, we're not talking about an urban legend from 100 years ago. We're talking about something recent, something raw, and something close to home. The case of 15-year-old August Borden here in my own community. Officially, it's been labeled a freak accident. Officially, the case has been closed. But if you live here, if you've listened to the conversations in this town, you know the story doesn't feel closed at all. This case left Tuscumbia with more questions than answers. I remember the first time I saw a post about August. I remember thinking, this doesn't sound like a regular accident. Then I started seeing more. People talking, people arguing, people asking questions. The more I saw, the more I felt that weight, that feeling of something is wrong. I was angry for August in my mind from everything I was hearing. I went into my head on how I would feel if something like this happened to my child. That feeling wasn't great. I could tell that some things being said could have obviously been wrong. Others I didn't know and could only imagine if it were the truth or not. I don't know August personally or his family, so I'm just a spectator looking at it. However, in today's episode, we can look into what we do know, the facts. Let's start there with what we know for sure, what's been reported publicly and said on the record. On August 19th, 2025, Deschler High School freshman August Borden was severely injured near the school stadium. The school reported that he had fallen in the street area between the campus and the stadium. He was found with extremely serious injuries: skull fractures, broken orbital sockets, a concussion, and significant bruising. He lost consciousness and required CPR. He was airlifted to Birmingham. Tuscumbia police originally believed the situation might rise to the level of reckless conduct and wanted to pursue charges. But when the case went up to the Madison County District Attorney's Office, that's where the narrative shifted. After the review, they ruled it a freak accident. Case closed. So that's what's on paper: a fall, a freak accident, and an officially closed investigation. I want you listening to think about this. If someone you loved had injuries this severe and the entire explanation was basically they fell, would that really sit right with you? From the official story to the town's reaction. If you stand in line at a grocery store here, sit in a local diner, or scroll through local social media, one thing becomes clear really fast. People are not at peace with this story. There's a feeling that what happened to August doesn't match the way it's been described. Some people are angry, some are scared, some are tired of hearing about it because it hurts too much to think about. Others are afraid to even talk about it publicly. But underneath all of that, there's this shared sense of we weren't given enough. We weren't told the whole thing. We weren't respected with the truth. This isn't just a Tuscumbia thing. If you've ever lived in a small town, you know this feeling. When something terrible happens and the public explanation feels thin, people don't just accept it and move on. They sit with it, they replay it, they dissect it. Now I want to pause here and speak from my own personal experience, not as anything but someone who has lived through a serious fall myself. This is by no means evidence nor a comparison, but just as a moment from my own life that shaped how I understand what a fall can do and what it usually doesn't. When I was about 10 years old, I had one of those childhood moments where you don't think, you just launch. My cousin and I were horseplaying in my parents' van while we waited to go to church. I was on the driver's side. He was on the passenger side with the sliding door open. I decided I was going to tackle him full speed and full commitment. He saw me coming and ducked. I went flying straight out of the van, face first, onto the gravel. I hit hard on the left side of my face. I looked like Two Face for about a month. I still have a tiny pebble on my forehead from that fall. The worst injury I walked away with was a broken nose, which still leans to the right today. I'm not telling the story to compare myself to August. I'm not saying my experience proves anything about what happened to him. I'm sharing it because it's the moment that comes to mind when I hear the word fall. When I think about the injuries I had versus the injuries described in August's case, it's hard for me to personally to reconcile the two. Not as a medical expert, not as an investigator, but as someone who has lived through a serious fall and knows what that looked like to me. Again, this is just my experience, but I think a lot of people in this town have had their own moments like that, their own falls, their own incidents, their own memories that make them pause and say, something about this doesn't feel right. When a whole community starts feeling that way, that's when a story stops being just an incident and becomes something heavier, something that lingers. With that said, let me take a sip of coffee here because that memory always hits me harder than I expect. Sometimes the past sneaks up on you like that. Now let's head back into the facts of the case. This is another part of this case that added gasoline to the fire, and that's the story of the man who came from out of state. A man traveled here because he didn't believe the official story. He made social media posts, He came to the school and he confronted the way this case was handled. Authorities say he made threats and he was arrested and was charged. That's the official side of the situation. But in the court of public opinion, it played out very differently. For a lot of people, it felt like this: someone came here, questioned the narrative, and instead of getting more answers, they got handcuffs. I'm not here to say whether what he said online was right or wrong. I'm not here to defend or condemn him. But I am here to say this: when people see someone show up asking questions and then see them arrested, it doesn't calm a community down. It does the opposite. It makes the story feel even more radioactive. For a community that prides itself on familiarity and knowing faces and stories, his presence carried a quiet gravity. There was a sense of uneasy empathy. A man driven far from home by unanswered questions, grief, or determination. We don't really know. But that empathy was quickly overtaken by shock when his search ended not in clarity, but in handcuffs. The arrest sent a ripple through Tuscumbia that was part disbelief, part sorrow, and part reckoning. It forced the community to confront the conclusion of hope and fear. Hope that truth might finally surface, and fear that the truth would be darker and closer than anyone wanted. Conversation shifted from curiosity to reflection, from whispers to somber pauses. People felt the heaviness of realizing that whatever had drawn this man across such distance was not just a distant tragedy, but something now firmly rooted in their own streets and memories. In the aftermath, Tuscumbia was left holding conflicting emotions at once: compassion for lives forever altered, grief for August Borden, and unmistakable sense that innocence, whether perceived or assumed, had been I can't even say the word, irrevocably shaken. We'll just say shaken. It was no longer just a story about someone coming to a town for answers. It became a moment that marked the community, reminding everyone how far pain can travel and how deeply it can settle once it arrives. In any case, involving minors, schools, and legal systems, you get layers of silence. Silence because of legal restrictions, silence because people are scared to talk, silence because they don't want their kids to be affected, silence because it's painful. But silence doesn't stop a story. It just pushes it into different rooms: group chats, closed Facebook groups, whispered conversations after church, private DMs. When the official information is limited, rumors explode to fill the space. One of the scariest things about situations like this is that the line between fact and rumor starts to blur. You've got official statements that fall too small, and then you've got stories that feel too big. Regular people are caught in the middle, trying to figure out what to believe. When people look at the case of 15-year-old like August Borden, many don't see it as isolated tragedy. They instinctively compare it to other moments they've watched unfold in the news: cases where a young person died or was harmed, and where, where the response from the schools, law enforcement, courts, or local leadership felt defensive rather than transparent. Not because every institution is malicious, but because institutions are built to protect themselves first. Across those cases, the pattern often feels the same. Early statements are cautious and tightly worded. Information is released slowly, selectively, or not at all. Timelines shift. Responsibility becomes diffused, passed from one agency to another until no single entity appears accountable. People who ask too many questions are framed as emotional, disruptive, or misinformed. Over time, the focus suddenly moves away from the child and toward procedure, policy, and liability. That's what people mean when they say institutions closed ranks. Not always a conspiracy, but a collective instinct to minimize exposure, protect reputations, and preserve authority. In that context, August's case resonates deeply because it carries that same emotional gravity, the sense that something essential is missing and that the truth may exist only in fragments, scattered across reports, memories, and silences. When someone like Terence travels 1,500 miles seeking answers and is met not with clarity, but with handcuffs, it amplifies that perception. To the community watching, it doesn't look like justice at work. It looks like a system reacting to pressure by asserting control. That's why the sentence, "we may never know the full truth," is so devastating. Humans can endure grief, even unimaginable grief, more easily when there is clarity. Truth gives pain a shape. It allows mourning to move somewhere, to anchor, to accountability, to reform, or at least to understanding. But uncertainty traps grief in place. It loops endlessly. What was missed? Who knew what? And when? Why wasn't this taken seriously? Without answers, the mind keeps reopening the wound, searching for a version of its events that finally makes sense. Living with not knowing also feels like a second injustice. It suggests that a life, especially a young life, did not warrant full transparency. That the system's comfort mattered more than a family's need for answers. That implication lingers long after headlines fade. Communities remember it, families carry it. It erodes trust not just in one institution, but in the idea that truth will surface if you wait long enough. In cases like this, people aren't always demanding a single, simple answer. Often they're asking for honesty about complexity, for acknowledgement of failures, blind spots, or uncomfortable facts. When that acknowledgement never comes, we may never know the full truth, becomes a kind of life sentence for those left behind. Not because they can't move forward, but because they must carry unresolved questions along their grief forever. That is what makes it one of the hardest sentences to live with. It doesn't close a chapter, it leaves the book open, unfinished, and permanently heavy in the hands of everyone who cared enough to ask why. This isn't just about Tuscumbia. This is about what happens anywhere a community feels like they're being asked to accept something that doesn't make sense. It's about trust. It's about whether people feel like their kids are safe. It's about whether they believe that if something terrible happens, the system will fight for the truth, even if it's messy, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it reflects badly on people in power. From a human standpoint, the lesson is uncomfortable, but ancient. We are far better at surviving harm than we are at facing it honestly. When something goes terribly wrong, especially involving a child, our first collective instinct is not truth, but containment. We try to shrink the damage, name it carefully, and move it somewhere it won't disturb the larger structure of our lives. That isn't because people don't care, it's because truth has consequences, and consequences require change. Change is frightening, so harm is often managed instead of confronted. This kind of case shows that we often treat harm as an incident rather than a failure of care. If it can be framed as tragic but inevitable, no one has to ask who was supposed to notice, intervene, or protect. Grief then becomes something private, something families are expected to carry quietly, while institutions remain intact and unexamined. Grief also makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't follow timelines or procedures. It's messy, repetitive, and emotional. Systems want closure. Grief wants truth. When those two collide, grief is usually the thing that gets pushed aside. Accountability is delayed, diluted, or buried in language, so technical it feels bloodless. In that space, people who keep asking questions are treated as problems rather than as witnesses to something unresolved. What this says about us is sobering. We often confuse peace with silence. We act as though things are healed once they are no longer being discussed, even when nothing has actually been repaired. From a purely human lens, the deepest harm isn't always the original act, it's the isolation that follows. When answers never come, people begin to doubt their own perceptions. Communities fracture between those who accept the official story and those who feel something is wrong but can't prove it. Over time, unresolved grief turns inward and becomes guilt, anger, or exhaustion. That's the quietest cruelty of all. Not the dramatic moment of loss, but the slow erosion of trust in others, in systems, and sometimes in oneself. This is where the themes you're drawn to live most powerfully. Darkness, in this context, isn't just evil or violence, it's an avoidance. It's the dimming of lights around uncomfortable facts, so no one has to look too closely. It's not always loud or monstrous. Sometimes it wears the face of professionalism, policy, or procedure. Truth isn't absent, it's fragmented. Pieces exist in emails, in overlooked warnings, in people's memories, in moments that felt wrong at the time but were dismissed. The tragedy is not that the truth is unknowable, but it is often knowable only if someone is willing to endure the fallout of acknowledging it. What's hidden in plain sight is perhaps the most haunting theme of all. The warning signs that didn't seem urgent, the discomfort that was easier to rationalize than comfort, the belief that someone else is handling it. In hindsight, these things glow like neon, but only because darkness was allowed to settle around them first. The human lesson here is this: harm doesn't thrive in secrecy alone, it thrives in denial, in politeness, in the refusal to make people uncomfortable. Your reoccurring themes should suggest a belief that truth has weight, that darkness is often subtle, and that what we refuse to name gains power over us. Cases like this aren't just stories of loss, they are mirrors. They ask whether we value truth more than comfort, and whether we are willing to sit with grief long enough for it to teach us something. Because the hardest truths are rarely hidden deep underground. They're usually standing right in front of us, waiting for someone brave enough to say, "This matters and it isn't over." Before we close tonight, I want to sit with this for a moment. Just breathe, because stories like this, they stay with you. So, where does that leave us? A boy was hurt, a town was shaken, a case was closed, a story was left hanging in the air. I don't have the power to reopen investigations. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an investigator. I'm not a person who lives. I'm just a person who lives here, who pays attention, and who believes that when something feels wrong, it's worth saying, "This doesn't sit right." If you're listening to this and you're from Tuscumbia, you already know how heavy this is. If you're listening from somewhere else, my hope is that you carry this story with you as a reminder that behind every clean phrase like freak accident is a family, a community, and layers of truth that don't always make it into a headline. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, where the coffee is strong and the stories are restless.